Thank you. Thank you very, very much. It is great to be with you. I give you my word. I will do my very, very best to try to keep my remarks under 21 hours. But you will know when I'm nearing the end if and when I bring out and begin to read The Cat in the Hat. You know, a few weeks ago, my wife Heidi and I, we had our two little girls, Caroline and Catherine, up in D.C. Caroline's 5, Catherine's 3. And it was a Sunday afternoon. We were driving down to Mount Vernon, spent a little bit of time with the girls. And as we're driving, Caroline asked her little sister, she says, "Catherine, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And Catherine says, "I want to work in the U.S. Senate. I want to work with Daddy." And Caroline says, "Oh, that's boring. We're going to be in a rock band." And then she let out the zinger. She said, "Besides, Daddy will be dead by then." That was a real conversation. I'm sitting there driving. I'm like, "Hello, I'm right in front of you." I kind of wondered if maybe Caroline had been speaking with Senate Republican leadership. If maybe she knew something I didn't know. Well, I will tell you, I just came from the Capitol, and I was asked to pass on an inquiry from Chairman Durbin. Are you now, or have you ever been, a member of ALEC? Well, I'll tell you, I first came to ALEC over a decade ago. When I was serving in the Bush administration, I've been privileged to work with ALEC in the federal government. I've been privileged to work with ALEC when I was back in Texas at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, leading the 10th Amendment Center, and I am proud to stand with ALEC today. You know, I'm not always a fan of the mainstream media. I know that's shocking to hear. But in this instance, I find myself in complete agreement with the Chicago Tribune, which said in August of 2013, "Free speech isn't always free. It gets downright cumbersome when Dick Durbin has you on his enemies list." The Tribune went on to say, going through the ALEC letter and asking, just like the IRS did, who are your donors, who dares support these guys? The Tribune goes on to say it would be more than wrong for a U.S. Senator to use the power of his high federal office as a cudgel against his enemies. We'll give the last word on that to Durbin himself. Quote, "It is absolutely unacceptable to single out any political group, right, left, or center, and say we're going to target them. That is unthinkable. That goes back to some of the worst days of the Richard Nixon administration." Well said. And I will tell you this, my advice to ALEC is very, very simple. Stand your ground. The reason I'm so happy to be here is this is a room full of patriots that are fighting to turn this country around. Y'all are fighting on the front lines. Every one of you has stepped forward, as Phil said, for a time such as this. For a time when there is such a need to defend liberty in this country, to pull us back from the brink. And each of you is leading the fights in your respective states. And so I just want to give 2 words of encouragement, and I want to leave a couple of minutes for a few Q&A as well. So I'm going to try to keep this relatively brief. But 2 words of encouragement in terms of how to go forward. Number 1, a bit of advice that I would encourage to all of you. Always champion growth and opportunity. There are two words that every Republican, I think, should tattoo on their hands. They should be growth and opportunity. My top priority in office is very simple. It's focused on bringing back economic growth, because growth is foundational to every other challenge we've got. Whether it's unemployment, whether it's the debt and deficit, whether it is maintaining our military, with growth we can do all of that. Without growth we can't do any of it. And I think as conservatives we need to be always championing economic growth in each of our respective states. You know, the last 4 years, from 2008 to 2012, our economy grew on average 0.9% a year. There's only one other period since World War II of 4 consecutive years of less than 1% average growth. That was 1979 to 1982. That was coming out of the Jimmy Carter administration. It was the same failed economic policies, out of control spending and taxes and regulation, and it produced the exact same stagnation. The men and women in this room know the answer for how you bring back economic growth. The way you bring back economic growth is the way we've done so over and over and over again. You rein in out of control spending, you limit taxes and have fundamental tax reform, and you pull back the crushing regulations that are hammering small businesses and killing jobs. Every time we have done so, whether in the 1920s or the 1960s or the 1980s, the result has been incredible economic growth. You know, by the 4th year of Ronald Reagan's administration, Reagan, like Obama, came into office with a lousy economy. And yet President Reagan implemented policies the exact opposite of President Obama's. And by the 4th year of his administration, anyone know what GDP growth was in this country in 1984? 7.2%. If President Obama, coming into office, inheriting the same lousy economy, had implemented the same economic policies Reagan had, and if the same economic growth had resulted, by today, we would have an additional 7 million new jobs. That is the equivalent of taking every single person who's unemployed in 46 of the 50 states and finding all of them a brand new job. Now think for a moment if y'all could go back to your states and talk to every single person in your state who's unemployed and have a new job for everyone. That's what we're fighting for. This stuff is transformational. And the reason growth matters so much is growth is foundational to opportunity. Growth yields opportunity. For a long time, I've advocated what I call opportunity conservatism, which is that every policy we think about, we talk about, should focus like a laser on easing the means of ascent up the economic ladder, on how it impacts the least well-off among us, that we should look at it through a Rawlsian lens. The single biggest lie in politics is that Republicans are the party of the rich. You know what? The rich do great with big government. Big business does great with big government. You know, right now, the top 1% in this country, the millionaires and billionaires, the president demagogues so much, earn a higher share of our national income than any time since 1928. If you were flying a private jet 5 years ago, you're still flying a private jet. But who are the losers in the Obama economy? They're young people, they're Hispanics, they're African Americans, they're single moms. They're the ones who are losing their jobs. When you hammer small businesses, 2/3 of all new jobs come from small businesses. When you put $1.7 trillion in new taxes, when you put massive job-killing regulations. And the single biggest job killer in this country is Obamacare. I got a note, by the way, boy, it's amazing how things can change in a few weeks in politics. Just a few weeks ago, people in Washington were saying, "Why on earth are you guys fighting so hard against Obamacare?" Now nobody's saying that. Over and over again, you run into people who say, "Now I understand what this was all about." You know, just a few weeks ago, Jay Leno in his monologue said, "So the other day, President Obama called me. He said, 'Jay, if you like your job, you can keep it.'" Well, and then a week later, Jay's monologue went back to the theme. He said, "So the holidays are approaching. Thanksgiving. You know, the first Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims said to the Indians, 'If you like your land, you can keep it.'" Victor, how was that? Was that okay? All right. You know, that's a sign of how things are penetrating the public consciousness. When people realize over 5 million people across this country have lost their health insurance. Millions across this country have lost their jobs or being forced into part-time work. And you know, I look at these issues from the perspective of my dad. Many of y'all have gotten to know my father. 55 years ago, when my dad fled Cuba, after being imprisoned and tortured, he came to America at 18 not speaking in English and washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. And what I try to ask is, how would that have impacted that 18-year-old kid? My father were washing dishes today, he very likely would have lost his job because of all of these taxes and all of these regulations. He almost certainly would have been forced to work 28, 29 hours a week because of Obamacare. There are single moms in every one of our states who are trying to feed their kids and have suddenly discovered they're working 29 hours a week. And we need to every day champion growth as the vehicle to opportunity, because the free market system in this country has been the greatest engine for prosperity and opportunity the world has ever seen. And the second bit of advice is very simple. Empower the people. Every one of you knows the answers to the challenges we have in this country are not going to come from Washington, D.C. They're going to come from the American people. And we are seeing a new paradigm in politics. With the internet, with social media, we are seeing citizens get active, get engaged. The level of activism at the grassroots is unlike anything I've ever seen before. Millions of Americans on issues after issues. You know, you look at my brief and very quiet tenure in the Senate. Issue after issue, the American people rising up is what made the difference. Whether it was standing up and fighting against drones with Rand Paul, where millions of Americans spoke up and forced the administration to admit the Constitution limits its power to target U.S. citizens. Or whether it was standing against the administration's policies trying to restrict the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, where millions of Americans rose up, and even though all of Washington thought those gun control proposals were unstoppable, the American people said otherwise. And when they came for a vote on the Senate floor, every single proposal of this administration to undermine the Second Amendment was voted down on the Senate floor. Or whether it is the fight over Obamacare, which we saw over the course of this fall, over 2 million Americans go and sign the national petition at don'tfundit.com and light up the phones on Capitol Hill. 2 million plus Americans making phone calls has a way of focusing the mind. You know, Ronald Reagan famously said, if you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat. And the American people, at the end of the day, every one of us is accountable to our constituents. You know, one of the things we're trying to do with Obamacare is tell the stories of the American people. We've launched a national website, MakeDCListen.org. MakeDCListen.org. It's a portal where individual citizens can go and upload their stories about Obamacare, about how it's impacting their job, about how it's impacting their health care. They can type it in, or even better, they can record it on their iPhone and upload a video. And we're trying to tell real human stories. 2 days ago in Odessa, a man told me about his 101-year-old aunt who just had her insurance canceled because it didn't have maternity coverage. The true story. He said, you know what? My aunt really doesn't want maternity coverage at this point. These are real stories about real people. Yesterday, down in Galveston, another gentleman told me his family's premiums went from $900 a month to $2,000 a month. He said, you know what? We can't afford $2,000 a month. This thing isn't working. Telling stories is critical. And the last thing I'll say is a word of encouragement. As dire as things are, I am profoundly optimistic. Because I think where we are right now is a great deal like the late 1970s. The late 1970s, we saw miserable economic policies coming out of Washington that led to economic stagnation and suffering. We saw feckless foreign policy that made the world a more dangerous place and jeopardized the United States. And yet, as a result, we saw a grassroots movement begin to sweep this country that became the Reagan Revolution. Millions of men and women, many of the men and women in this room bear the scars from that battle, rose up and said, there is a better way. We can get back to the free market principles, the constitutional principles that make our nation strong. And the American people rose up and pulled us back from the brink. We did it then. We can do it again. We can achieve morning in America. And with that, I am happy to answer or dodge any question you like. Yeah.
Recently, there was a book released by Mark Levin regarding the Liberty Amendments, some of them specifically the 17th Amendment, dealing with the state legislators in this room and how to deal with that. Would you comment on that concept and where you feel about it?
Well, I'll say first of all, I'm a huge fan of Mark Levin, the great one, and he is fearless, and fearless is a rare commodity in politics these days. I am also, one of the things Mark does a great job of is focusing on our Constitution, on the need to get back to our Constitution. You look at the 17th Amendment. Once you guys stopped picking us, everything went downhill after that. Prior to the 17th Amendment, the state legislature's ability and authority to select senators was a powerful check on the federal government coming and intruding into the prerogatives of the state. Because if you have the ability to hire and fire me, I'm a lot less likely to break into your house and steal your television. So there's no doubt that was a major step towards the explosion of federal power and the undermining of the authority in the states and at the local level. And I am a big believer at looking at constitutional amendments to turn things around. I'll tell you, of all the amendments, there are two that I think are most important. One amendment is a strong, balanced budget amendment. And the second amendment is the amendment called the Madison Amendment. Which derives from James Madison's understandings of how constitutional amendments would occur, and what it says is state legislatures can propose specific amendments. The Madison Amendment would give, rather than just the authority to call a constitutional convention, the Madison Amendment would explicitly give state legislatures the authority to propose specific amendments, and if a sufficient number of states propose the exact same amendment, that amendment automatically goes to the states for ratification. What it does is it gives state legislatures a significant structural check over the usurpation of power from Congress. I think it's a great idea. It's something that I think ought to happen.
Senator Cruz, thank you for being a warrior for the conservative causes. I have a question to ask you. What can we do as legislators? I know the rules of the Senate have changed regarding our courts to make sure we can get conservative people on there or fight back somehow. What do you suggest we can do as legislators? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question, and obviously it points to the nuclear option that Harry Reid exercised a couple of weeks ago. And the nuclear option was a blatant abuse of power. It was designed really to do two things. Number one, to try to change the topic from Obamacare. And I got to say, I think Democrats in Washington right now are getting more and more terrified at just how badly Obamacare is going. Another late-night comics observed that a new world record was set in the 100-yard dash. And that's Democrats running away from Obamacare. And so I think part of the reason for pulling the nuclear option was to try to change the topic, and it's the same abuse of power. Just like President Obama promised, if you like your plan, you can keep it, Harry Reid repeatedly promised he wouldn't use the nuclear option to change the rules of the Senate, and both of them just flat out broke their promise. But it also was very directly derived from Obamacare, because I think the Obama administration has decided it's going to focus almost all of its energy on executive power, executive orders, and regulations. That they've largely written off Congress, they've largely written off the legislative process, the constitutional process. And so instead, they intend to go on the executive side. And I have to tell you, the abuse of power and the lawlessness is one of the most disturbing aspects of this administration. The nuclear option was directed exactly at that because it was directed at 3 judges on the D.C. Circuit, the circuit that hears most of the challenges to the abuse of executive authority on Obamacare and everything else. Right now, the D.C. Circuit is evenly split between Republican nominees and Democrat nominees. And what Harry Reid and the Democrats are trying to do is pack it with 3 additional judges they believe will rubber stamp the president's abuses of executive authority. It is dangerous, it's unconscionable. Now, your question is, what can we do? Under the Senate rules, we can't stop them. That's what the nuclear option did. But what we can do, and this is something that every one of you can do just as much as we can, is we can shine light. We can shine light on the abuse of power, on the lawlessness, on the failures of Obamacare and how it's hurting the American people. And I think truth is a powerful disinfectant. I think shining light, they don't want to defend the records of these guys. They just want to exercise raw power. And speaking the truth is, I think, always the most powerful antidote, especially because we have an environment where the grassroots are so much better informed. You know, there was a time when gatekeepers decided what the people could hear. We don't live in that world anymore, so the more we get information out to the people, the better. I'll give you an example of that. Since the filibuster, the hashtag that we launched during the filibuster, Make DC Listen, has been tweeted over 1 million times. People, when they get engaged, can change public policy. And I think that's the most important thing on judges right now, is to highlight and speak the truth. All right, let's do one last question because I want to respect y'all's time. Yes, sir.
Back on Obamacare, if if you were successful in not funding it, the mandates are still there, which are really causing the harm, the 101-year-old lady having to get maternity coverage. What can happen? I mean, is it going to get bad enough where the Democrats are willing to override a veto?
It's a great question. It depends. It depends if they feel enough heat. Look, one of the things the media wants to do right now is make it all about the website. And the website's a disaster, still a disaster. But eventually they're going to get it right. I mean, it was a demonstration of manifest incompetence. But eventually they'll get the website right. And the media is just waiting to write the story. Hey, website's fixed, everything's okay, nothing to see here, move on. And the problem with Obamacare was never the silly website. The problem with Obamacare is that it's destroying jobs, it's hurting the most vulnerable people among us, and it is absolutely destroying our healthcare system. And one thing to understand, there was a trade-off at the heart of Obamacare that the American people were deliberately misled about. Once fully implemented, CBO projects that Obamacare will cover roughly 20 to 25 million people. A third to a half of the uninsured. Another half will remain uninsured. So it's part of covering part of the uninsured population. And you know what? That is a noble goal, to try to extend health insurance to people who don't have it. But the trade-off to cover those 20 to 25 million people was that Obamacare deliberately jeopardized the private health insurance of roughly 200 million people in the rest of the country. And that wasn't an unintended side effect. It was the intended purpose. The people whose plans are being canceled, that the administration professes surprise at, the law makes their plans illegal. And there are more shoes to drop. We've seen 5 to 7 million people lose their insurance already, mostly in the individual market. And I'll tell you, and I'm sure you're experiencing this at home, but when I travel Texas, I see men and women who stop me all the time, who put their hand on my shoulder and they say, Ted, I'm scared. I just got a cancellation notice in the mail. I've lost my health insurance. I've got a child with diabetes. I don't know what we're going to do. These are real people. They're not abstract, not theoretical. They're real people who are suffering right now in every state in the union. But the next shoe to drop is going to be that more and more people are going to realize that the other promise, if you like your doctor, you can keep him, is every bit as untrue. The state of Texas, Texas Oncology, one of the largest providers of oncology services, has said it's not participating in Obamacare. You know, I've got a very close friend who's a cancer survivor, who's dealing with the reality that it's very likely he's not going to be able to continue to see his cancer doctor. He's got 2 little kids at home. You want to talk about something that focuses the mind, the doctor that you're entrusting to keep you alive so you can be a father for your kids, the federal government just told you you can't keep seeing that doctor. Then this spring, the next big shoe to drop is going to be the premium increases. Because the young, healthy people that were supposed to sign up and supposed to be used to subsidize everyone else are not signing up. And so the people who are signing up are older and not as healthy. So we get to this spring and we're going to see massive premium increases that are going to shock people across this country. And then the shoes to drop, you're going to see small businesses, the small group markets, more and more cancellations coming. And then finally, the biggest shoe to drop are large groups, large employer markets, 140 million people. It's estimated as many as 100 million people may lose their health insurance. I can't tell you how many HR directors at big companies have told me privately they're just sitting and waiting to dump every one of their employees onto the exchanges. Now, if President Obama had simply told the truth, had been candid to the country, that he's got a plan, and the plan is we're going to extend coverage to 20 to 25 million people, and in exchange, we're going to screw up the health insurance for 200 million people, he would have been laughed off the stage. That's what this law does. And I would note, you know, at this point, for all of us, opposing Obamacare is not a matter of ideology. 3.5 years ago, reasonable minds perhaps could have differed on whether this thing might work. Today, nobody can make that argument. Today, I would suggest to you it is the essence of pragmatism to simply acknowledge this thing isn't working. When you've got 5 million people who've lost their health insurance and a couple of 100,000 who've gotten health insurance, it ain't working, and the most reasonable, pragmatic, middle-of-the-road, common-sense thing to do is acknowledge it's not working and start over. Now, your question was, will the Democrats go that far? There's only one possible reason they might, which is if they are scared out of their living minds. And the only people that can scare them out of their living minds are their constituents back home. But I'll tell you, the more the American people experience this firsthand, the more they are stepping forward and holding their elected officials accountable. And I believe we are going to stop Obamacare, but the way we're going to do it is by speaking the truth to the American people, empowering the American people, because it's the American people who can hold our elected officials accountable. It's the American people who can pull us back from this brink. And I'm convinced we're going to do it, but we're going to do it by speaking the truth, because what we know here, we're right. You know, I've had some folks who says, well, gosh, you guys were really lucky this thing has worked so badly. I said, lucky? Number one, there's nothing lucky about millions of Americans hurting and suffering. But number two, truth matters. This law is a disaster, and if you're speaking the truth, it's always, always the right thing to do. Freedom works. Free market policies work. Allowing and creating environments where small businesses can prosper and people with nothing can climb the economic ladder. That works. We are right, and we need to speak the truth and empower the American people. And the men and women in this room are doing that each and every day, and it is my distinct honor to stand shoulder to shoulder with each of you. Thank you.